Hey everyone, welcome back to Hands on Books. But if this is your first time here, the idea behind the show is to do something fun and creative with my favorite hobby, which is book collecting. So I've got a pile of unopened, mostly used books here that we pick from at random to see what we get. Maybe you'll find your next book or be introduced to a new topic, but the goal here is to share the experience of the books themselves. If this is something you enjoy, feel free to like the video, subscribe to the channel to receive notifications, leave a comment, and share with your friends. Let's get started. All right, let's see what we got. Better World Books always has these kind of vacuum sealed sticky things. Oh, cool. All right. So this is Julian by Gore Vidal. Let's get the sticker off. Slowly to leave the least amount of glue on there. All right. So I've never read anything by Gore Vidal before, but I used to kind of have this knee-jerk reaction against, I don't know why, but I had this sort of knee-jerk reaction against historical fiction in general. But then I realized that that was crazy, and whenever I read Salambo, that sort of changed my mind. But so this is a historical fiction novel about Julian, the Roman Emperor Julian the Apostate. So on the back here we have, in the turbulent life of Julian the Apostate, the nephew of Emperor Constantine the Great, who ascended the throne in AD 361 at the age of 29 and was murdered 4 years later after an unsuccessful attempt to restore the worship of the old gods. Gore Vidal has found an ideal subject for one of the best of all his historical novels. I think I got this one because I was looking for books on Julian, and then this like historical novel by a famous author came up, and I thought that was worth a shot. Yeah, this had good reviews. I don't know. Like I said, I've never read anything by Gore Vidal, so it just seemed like a cool topic. I like a historical novel set back a few thousand years. Paperback from 77. Let's see how it smells. It smells really good. Just smells like, one of those old mass market paperbacks. Cool map of the Roman Empire in the 4th century. Yeah, so as the back says, Julian was the nephew of Constantine, so he was sort of like reacting against the Christianization of the empire, but he was a philosopher and in his own right as well. Robert Graves, when he came to publish his sequel to I, Claudius, remarked in a somewhat irritable preface that a good many reviewers seemed to think he had simply spun himself a novel from Suetonius's gossip, which looked to them like a very easy thing to do. In Claudius the God, Graves struck back with a long bibliography, listing nearly every relevant text which has survived from the ancient world. Unfortunately, I have not read as much as all that, but to anticipate those who might think that one's only source was the history of Ammianus Marcellinus or even of Edward Gibbon, I have included at the end of the book a partial bibliography. The Emperor Julian's life is remarkably well documented. 3 volumes of his letters and essays survive, while such acquaintances as Libanius and St. Gregory of Nazianzus wrote vivid accounts of him. Though I have written a novel, not a history, I have tried to stay with the facts, only occasionally shifting things around. For instance, it is unlikely that Priscus joined Julian in Gaul, but it is useful to the narrative to have him there. Julian has always been something of an underground hero in Europe. His attempt to stop Christianity and revive Hellenism exerts still a romantic appeal, and he crops up in odd places, particularly during the Renaissance and again in the 19th century. Two such likely authors as Lorenzo de' Medici and Henrik Ibsen wrote plays about him. But aside from the unique adventure of Julian's life, what continues to fascinate is the 4th century itself. During the years between the accession of Julian's uncle Constantine the Great and Julian's death at 32, Christianity was established. For better or worse, we are today very much the result of what they were then. In naming cities, I have given the modern rather than the ancient name, Milan, not Mediolanum, except when the original name is more familiar to us, Ephesus, not Selçuk. Dates I put in our fashion, AD and BC. Since Julian's court was a military one, I have used our own army's way of dating. Currency is a tricky matter. No one is quite certain what the exact purchasing power of money was in the 4th century, but a gold solidus was probably worth about $5. Julian, Priscus, and Libanius, the three narrators of the story, all wrote Greek. Their Latin was rather shaky, as they are quick to remind us, but they occasionally use Latin terms, much the way we do. For those readers who will search in vain for Julian's famous last words, "Thou hast conquered, Galilean," he never said them. Theodoret must take credit for this fine rhetoric, composed a century after Julian's death. I should like to thank the American Academy at Rome and the American School of Classical Studies at Athens for letting me use their libraries. GV. I'll bet those are cool libraries. Chapter 1. Youth. Libanius to Priscus, Antioch, March 8380. Yesterday morning, as I was about to enter the lecture hall, I was stopped by a Christian student who asked me in a voice eager with malice, "Have you heard about the Emperor Theodosius?" I cleared my throat, ready to investigate the nature of this question, but he was too quick for me. He has been baptized a Christian. I was non-committal. Nowadays, one never knows who is a secret agent. Also, I was not particularly surprised at the news. When Theodosius fell ill last winter and the bishops arrived like vultures to pray over him. I knew that should he recover, they would take full credit for having saved him. He survived. Now we have a Christian emperor in the East, to match Gratian, our Christian emperor in the West. It was inevitable. I turned to go inside, but the young man was hardly finished with his pleasant task. Theodosius has also issued an edict. It was just read in front of the Senate House. I heard it. Did you? No, but I always enjoy imperial prose, I said politely. You may not enjoy this. The emperor has declared heretic all those who do not follow the Nicene Creed. I'm afraid Christian theology is not really my subject. The edict hardly applies to those of us who are still faithful to philosophy. It applies to everyone in the East. He said this slowly, watching me all the while. The emperor has even appointed an inquisitor to determine one's faith. The days of toleration are over. I was speechless. The sun flared in my eyes. All things grew confused, and I wondered if I was about to faint, or even die. But the voices of two colleagues recalled me. I could tell by the way they greeted me that they, too, had heard about the edict and were curious to know my reaction. I gave them no pleasure. Of course I expected it, I said. The Empress Postuma wrote me only this week to say that... I invented freely. I have not, of course, heard from the Empress in some months, but I thought that the enemy should be reminded to what extent I enjoy the favor of Gratian and Postuma. It is humiliating to be forced to protect oneself in this way, but these are dangerous times. So that writing didn't really come out and grab me, but I know it's, written in Libanius's voice. So let me see if I can get to some narrative portion of the story. So we have Priscus responding to Libanius. Libanius back to Priscus, Priscus back to Libanius. Part 2, the Memoir of Julian Augustus. Yeah, let's read this first page, or the first little bit of part of it in Julian's voice. From the example of my uncle, the Emperor Constantine, called the Great, who died when I was 6 years old, I learned that it is dangerous to side with any party of the Galileans, for they mean to overthrow and veil those things that are truly holy. I can hardly remember Constantine, though I was once presented to him at the sacred palace. I dimly recall a giant, heavily scented, wearing a stiff jeweled robe. My older brother Gallus always said that I tried to pull his wig off, but Gallus had a cruel humor, and I doubt that the story was true. If I had tugged at the emperor's wig, I would surely not have endeared myself to him, for he was as vain as a woman about his appearance. Even his Galilean admirers admit to that. From my mother, Basilina, I inherited my love of learning. I never knew her. She died shortly after my birth, 7th of April, 331. She was the daughter of the Praetorian prefect, Julius Julianus. From portraits, I resemble her more than I do my father. I share with her a straight nose and rather full lips, unlike the imperial Flavians, who tend to have thin, hooked noses and tight, pursed mouths. The Emperor Constantius, my cousin and predecessor, was a typical Flavian, resembling his father Constantine, except that he was much shorter. But I did inherit the Flavian thick chest and neck, legacy of our Illyrian ancestors, who were men of the mountains. My mother, though Galilean, was devoted to literature. She was taught by the eunuch Mardonius, who was also my tutor. From Mardonius, I learned to walk modestly with my eyes to the ground, not strutting or measuring the effect I was creating on others. I was also taught self-discipline in all things. He particularly tried to keep me from talking too much. Fortunately, now that I am emperor, everyone delights in my conversation. Mardonius also convinced me that time spent at the games or in the theater was time wasted. And finally, it was from Mardonius, a Galilean, who loved Hellenism too well, that I learned about Homer and Hesiod, Plato and Theophrastus. He was a good teacher, if severe. From my cousin and predecessor, the Emperor Constantius, I learned to dissemble and disguise my true thoughts. A dreadful lesson, but had I not learned it, I would not have lived past my 20th year. In the year 337, Constantius murdered my father. His crime? Consanguinity. I was spared because I was 6 years old. My half-brother Gallus, who was 11 years old, was spared because he was sickly and not expected to live. Yes, I was trying to imitate the style of Marcus Aurelius to himself, and I have failed. Not only because I lack his purity and goodness, but because while he was able to write of the good things he learned from a good family and good friends, I must write of those bitter things I learned from a family of murderers in an age diseased by the quarrels and intolerance of a sect whose purpose it is to overthrow that civilization whose first note was struck upon blind Homer's lyre. I am not Marcus Aurelius, in excellence or in experience. I must speak now in my own voice. I like that. This seems like a good book to take on like a vacation. We'll see. I'll read some more of it and see if I can, see if it hooks me, I guess. All right, guys, I just wanted to give a little recap and some pricing and quality info on Julian by Gore Vidal. I did give this a little bit of time and read some of the opening chapters, and it's got a cool structure. The narrative frame is between these two elderly friends of Julian who are corresponding about publishing his memoirs, and so you've got some back and forth between those two, and then the actual manuscript itself is presented as like the body of the novel, and then you have like scholia by both of them interspersed to give like some alternate viewpoints on stuff. So it is a cool frame, but one that doesn't really seem to lend itself to like a lot of engaging action, I guess, because, you know, at the beginning of the story, both of the other two guys, Priscus and Libanius, are already pretty old. This is after Julian's death. So it's not that, like, you don't know the fate of the protagonist. And then when you're hearing it in Julian's voice, you know he survives everything that he writes about. So, like, in both senses, maybe there's, like, not a lot of tension to the narrative. But I've also only read, like, 30 pages, so maybe it gets a lot cooler. I might bring this with me on an upcoming vacation and see if it sucks me in. But all in all, it does seem kind of like some interesting light reading where you have some historical figures enfleshed, and you get to see some people walking around that you usually don't get to see, like Constantine and Eusebius and people like that. And as far as pricing and quality go, I got this one on Abe Books for $8. It's just one of these old paperbacks, mass market paperbacks. It's not in amazing condition, but, you know, for $8, it's a cool addition to the library. All right, I think that's going to do it for this episode. If this is something you enjoyed, feel free to like the video, subscribe to the channel, share it with your friends, leave a comment down below. Until next time, happy reading!